here! This place isn't for your kind! There are levels here!
Flight attendant snaps black girl's arm, seconds later she's fired, and what happened in those seconds will make you question everything you thought you knew about flying while black in America. First class isn't typically for passengers like you, flight attendant Connie Morrison said as she looked down at 13-year-old Grace and her 72-year-old grandmother Dorothy like they were stains on her pristine cabin. There must be a system error with your tickets. The words hit Grace first, then Dorothy, both of them feeling that familiar sting that comes when someone looks at your skin and decides you don't belong, decides that no matter what your boarding pass says, no matter what you paid, no matter that this is supposed to be America in the 21st century, you are still somehow less than human in their eyes. Now before you think this is ancient history, before you scroll past thinking we've moved beyond the ugliness of segregation and Jim Crow, let me tell you something that will shake you to your core. Racism on airplanes isn't just alive, it's thriving, it's evolved, it's learned to wear a professional uniform and smile while it destroys you. We want to believe that Rosa Parks changed everything, that the civil rights movement ended discrimination, that Dr. King's dream came true somewhere between 1968 and now, but the truth is hatred just got better at hiding, just learned new ways to humiliate black bodies at 30,000 feet. Dorothy looked at Connie with eyes that had seen this before, had survived worse than this, had lived through actual segregation when colored-only signs were legal and lynching was common. She wasn't surprised by the flight attendant's contempt, wasn't shocked that in 2024 a grown woman could look at a grieving child and her grandmother and decide they didn't deserve dignity. This was just another Tuesday for a black woman who'd spent 72 years proving her humanity to people determined not to see it. But Grace, sweet Grace, who was already carrying the weight of her grandfather's death like a stone in her chest, who clutched a small velvet pouch containing his ashes against her heart, who hadn't smiled in 3 months since the man who taught her to fish and play chess and believe she could be anything had stopped breathing, Grace felt something inside her crack just a little bit more. They were on Flight 2847 to Savannah, trapped in seats 3A and 3B in the first-class cabin of an aircraft that should have felt spacious but suddenly felt like a cage. Dorothy held her granddaughter's trembling hand and straightened her spine, that same spine that had carried her through decades of being told she wasn't good enough, wasn't worthy, didn't belong. "Our tickets are legitimate, young lady," Dorothy said with the kind of dignity that comes from surviving what would have broken lesser people. "We're staying." Connie's jaw tightened and her eyes went cold, that particular kind of cold that comes right before cruelty, and she walked away muttering just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear about people who don't understand first-class etiquette, about system errors and mistakes and how standards were slipping. Around them, other passengers watched with varying degrees of discomfort, some frowning, some shaking their heads, one businessman pulling out his phone to record because apparently witnessing injustice through a screen is easier than intervening with your voice. An older white woman across the aisle whispered to her husband that this doesn't seem right, but the whisper stayed a whisper, never becoming the shout that might have stopped what was coming. Grace leaned into her grandmother and whispered the words that break every adult's heart. "Grandma, maybe we should move. I don't want trouble." Dorothy squeezed her granddaughter's hand tighter, felt the velvet pouch with her grandfather's ashes pressed between them, thought about the beach in Savannah where they were supposed to scatter those ashes at sunset, where her husband had proposed 53 years ago, where they were supposed to find healing and closure and peace. "Baby, your grandfather didn't raise me to run from ignorance," Dorothy said quietly, "and I didn't raise your mother to run either. We stay." But Connie Morrison wasn't done with them, not even close, and what she did next in her determination to put these black females in their place would result in a sound that every passenger in that cabin would hear in their nightmares for years to come. 30 minutes into the flight, Grace unbuckled her seatbelt and stood on shaking legs because she needed to use the bathroom, because 13-year-old bodies don't care about racism or confrontation or fear. And that's when Connie appeared like she'd been waiting for this exact moment. "Where do you think you're going?" Connie demanded, blocking the aisle with her body. If you believe no child should ever have to experience what's about to happen to Grace, keep watching because this story takes a turn that will make you weep and rage in equal measure. If you think racial discrimination on airplanes is something we left in the 1960s, you need to see what happens in the next 60 seconds. And if you've ever been treated like you don't belong somewhere because of how you look, drop a comment below and tell us your story. Tell us where you're watching from and what time it is right now. We're reading every single one. This story doesn't end the way you think. Hit that like button if you stand against racism. Subscribe to this channel because we're exposing incidents that airlines don't want you to see, and trust me, what comes next will change how you see everything. But to understand how a flight attendant could look at a grieving child and see nothing but a problem to be solved with violence, we need to go back 6 hours to when Grace's day started with hope instead of horror, back to when this trip was supposed to be about healing instead of breaking. Grace Turner woke up that morning in her grandmother's house in Charleston, the same house where her grandfather had lived until his heart gave out 3 months ago, the same house that still smelled like his coffee and his aftershave and all the memories that Grace wasn't ready to let go of yet. She was 13 years old, an 8th grader who loved ballet and chemistry in equal measure, a kid who'd won the school science fair 2 years running and was supposed to perform the lead role in her dance recital in 3 weeks, a performance she'd been rehearsing for 6 months. But today wasn't about science or dance. Today was about saying goodbye to the man who'd been her best friend since before she could walk. Her grandfather James had taught her to play chess when she was 5, had taken her fishing every summer since she was 7, had told her stories about growing up in the segregated South and surviving things that would have destroyed weaker men. He'd been a postal worker for 42 years, had served in Vietnam, had marched with thousands of others for voting rights when Dorothy was pregnant with Grace's mother. Grace's relationship with her grandfather had been the kind of bond that transcends generations, built on Saturday morning pancakes and evening chess matches and long conversations about everything from quantum physics to why people hate each other for no good reason. When he died suddenly of a massive heart attack while working in his garden, Grace had stopped talking for 3 days, had stopped eating for 2, had stopped believing that the world made any sense at all. Her grandmother Dorothy had been married to James for 53 years, had loved him since she was 19 years old, and he was a skinny 21-year-old soldier about to ship out to a war that would change him in ways she couldn't yet understand. He'd proposed to her on a beach in Savannah, had gotten down on one knee in the sand at sunset and promised to love her until his last breath, a promise he'd kept even when that last breath came too soon and left her alone in a house that echoed with his absence. Dorothy was 72 years old, a retired elementary school teacher who'd spent 40 years shaping young minds, a woman who'd raised 3 children and helped raise 7 grandchildren, a civil rights veteran who'd been arrested twice in the 1960s for sitting at lunch counters that didn't want her black body taking up space meant for white customers. She moved a little slower now, her knees aching with arthritis, her hands not as steady as they used to be, but her spirit remained unbroken, her dignity intact, her belief in justice still flickering even after a lifetime of evidence to the contrary. That morning, Dorothy had helped Grace pack a small carry-on bag with clothes for their overnight trip to Savannah, had double-checked their boarding passes that her son Michael had purchased for them, first-class tickets because he wanted his mother and daughter to travel in comfort, to have this one journey be easy and peaceful and worthy of the sacred mission they were undertaking. The velvet pouch containing James's ashes sat on the kitchen counter, small and unassuming, containing all that remained of a man who'd filled entire rooms with his presence. Grace had picked up the pouch with trembling hands, had held it against her chest like she could feel her grandfather's heartbeat through the fabric, like maybe if she held on tight enough he'd come back somehow. Dorothy had watched her granddaughter's face crumple with fresh grief and had pulled the child into her arms, both of them crying together in the kitchen where James used to make his terrible coffee and his wonderful jokes. "We're going to scatter his ashes where he proposed to me," Dorothy had whispered into Grace's hair, "where he promised to love me forever, where the ocean meets the sky and everything feels possible, that's where your grandfather belongs." The drive to the airport had been quiet, Grace staring out the window at a world that kept moving even though her grandfather had stopped, Dorothy humming old hymns under her breath the way she did when she needed strength. At the airport, check-in went smoothly. The agent smiled at them and wished them a good flight. Security was routine and unremarkable, and for a brief moment Dorothy had allowed herself to believe that maybe this trip would go exactly as planned, that maybe they'd find some peace in Savannah, that maybe grief could start transforming into something bearable. They'd boarded early, the gate agent calling for passengers needing assistance and families with small children, and Dorothy's arthritis qualified her for pre-boarding even though she hated admitting she needed help. They'd walked down the jetway together, Grace still clutching the velvet pouch, Dorothy holding her granddaughter's free hand, both of them carrying grief like luggage too heavy to check. Finding seats 3A and 3B in first class had felt like a small victory, wide leather seats with plenty of legroom, enough space that Dorothy could stretch her aching knees, enough comfort that maybe Grace could rest during the short flight. They'd settled in carefully, Grace taking the window seat so she could look out at the clouds, Dorothy on the aisle so she could get up easily if needed. The other passengers in first class had been the usual mix, business travelers in expensive suits typing on laptops, an older white couple who smiled politely as they passed, a young family with a toddler who was already fussing about the seatbelt. Everything seemed normal, seemed fine, seemed like just another flight on just another Tuesday. Then Connie Morrison had emerged from the galley during boarding, her eyes scanning first class with the kind of proprietary assessment that suggested she saw this cabin as her personal domain. She was 49 years old, a 26-year veteran flight attendant who'd worked for this airline since 1998, a woman with a spotless service record and exactly 17 complaints from passengers over the years, 16 of those complaints filed by passengers who happened to be black. Connie had been raised in a small town where segregation wasn't legal anymore but social separation remained the norm, where black families lived on one side of the railroad tracks and white families on the other, where nobody said the quiet parts out loud but everyone understood the rules. She'd learned early that there were spaces for certain people and spaces for others, and even though the laws had changed, even though she couldn't legally enforce the separation her parents' generation had taken for granted, she'd found subtle ways to make people understand where they did and didn't belong. Her eyes had landed on Grace and Dorothy, on their black faces in first-class seats, and something had hardened in her expression, some old familiar resentment rising up like bile. She'd approached their row with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, had looked at their boarding passes like she was inspecting counterfeit money, had delivered her poison with professional courtesy wrapped around racial contempt. "These seats are reserved," she'd said, and those 3 words had started a chain of events that would end with a child's screams echoing through the cabin and a flight attendant's career destroyed beyond repair. But Grace and Dorothy didn't know that yet, didn't know that Connie's harassment was just beginning, didn't know that the next hour would test everything they believed about dignity and justice and whether speaking up actually matters when the person with power has decided you don't deserve basic human decency. They just knew that once again, someone was looking at their skin and deciding they didn't belong, and once again they'd have to prove their right to exist in a space they'd paid for. Dorothy had responded to Connie's poison with the kind of patient dignity that comes from surviving worse, her voice steady and kind even as her heart recognized the familiar sting of being judged unworthy. "Ma'am, these are our assigned seats. My son purchased them for us," she'd said, holding up their boarding passes like evidence in a trial she shouldn't have to defend. Connie had examined those passes like they were forgery, holding them up to the overhead light, squinting at the seat numbers, her face twisted with theatrical suspicion that made it clear to everyone watching that this wasn't about verifying tickets. This was about putting these black women in what she considered their proper place. "There must be a system error," she'd announced loud enough for half the cabin to hear. "First class isn't typically 4, and then she'd paused, her eyes traveling over Dorothy's worn but clean Sunday dress and Grace's nervous young face. "Passengers like you." The words hung in the recycled air like a slap, and Grace had physically shrunk into her seat, her shoulders curling inward, her hand instinctively clutching the velvet pouch with her grandfather's ashes tighter against her chest. But Dorothy had done the opposite, had straightened that spine that carried her through lunch counter sit-ins in 1963, through raising 3 children on a teacher's salary after her husband came back from Vietnam changed and struggling, through burying that same husband 3 months ago and somehow finding the strength to wake up every morning after. "Our tickets are legitimate, young lady," Dorothy had said, and the phrase young lady carried just enough edge to remind Connie that this 72-year-old black woman had been fighting ignorance before the flight attendant was even born. "We're staying." Connie's jaw had tightened, her professional mask slipping just enough to show the rage underneath, and she'd walked away without another word. But anyone who thought the confrontation was over didn't understand how racism works, didn't realize that for people like Connie, being defied by the very people she considered beneath her was gasoline on a fire that had been smoldering her entire life. Throughout the boarding process, while other passengers settled into their seats and stowed their carry-ons and made small talk about weather and connections, Connie found excuses to hover near row 3. She walked past their seats 6 times in 15 minutes, each pass bringing a new microaggression, a new small cruelty designed to make Dorothy and Grace understand they weren't welcome. She bumped Dorothy's shoulder hard enough to make the older woman wince, then offered a false apology dripping with contempt. "Oh, excuse me, I didn't see you there." She announced to no one in particular but loud enough for everyone to hear that some passengers don't understand first-class etiquette, that standards have really declined, that it's so hard to maintain a professional environment when people who aren't accustomed to this level of service don't know how to behave. Other flight attendants shot her looks ranging from confused to uncomfortable, but none of them intervened, none of them told her to stop, none of them chose these passengers over their colleague. When Connie came through taking drink orders, she asked every single person in first class what they'd like, worked her way methodically down the aisle with her practiced smile and her clipboard, taking orders for champagne and orange juice and coffee and sparkling water. She reached row 3 and walked right past without breaking stride, didn't even glance in their direction, treated Dorothy and Grace like empty seats, like air, like nothing. Grace had watched this happen with tears pooling in her eyes, had seen the flight attendant serve the white businessman in 2A and the white couple in 4C and everyone else who looked like they belonged, and the message was crystal clear even to a 13-year-old still processing grief. You don't matter, you aren't worthy, you don't deserve even the basic courtesy we extend to everyone else. "Grandma, maybe we should move," Grace had whispered, her voice small and broken. "I don't want trouble." Dorothy had squeezed her granddaughter's hands so tight it almost hurt, had felt her own heart breaking because this child who'd already lost so much, who was carrying her grandfather's ashes to a beach where they were supposed to find peace, was now learning the same painful lesson Dorothy had learned at her age, that being black in America means constantly having to prove you deserve to exist in spaces white people consider theirs. "Baby, your grandfather didn't raise me to run from ignorance," Dorothy had said quietly, "and I didn't raise your mother to run either, we stay." Around them, other passengers were absolutely noticing what was happening, couldn't help but notice Connie's obvious harassment, the way she kept circling back to bother these 2 black females, the way she'd skipped them during drink service, the pointed comments about etiquette and standards. The businessman in the suit frowned and looked like he might say something, then went back to his laptop. The older white couple whispered to each other that this seems inappropriate, but the whisper never became action, never transformed into intervention. A young mother 3 rows back pulled out her phone and started recording, capturing Connie's behavior for social media, for evidence, for the kind of viral documentation that makes people feel like they're participating in justice without actually having to risk anything. She filmed the microaggressions, filmed Connie's contemptuous expressions, filmed Dorothy's dignified resistance and Grace's frightened face, but she didn't stand up, didn't call out the flight attendant, didn't use her voice to defend a child being psychologically tortured. The plane took off and climbed to cruising altitude, and for 30 minutes Dorothy and Grace sat in their legitimate first-class seats being treated like criminals, like trespassers, like problems that needed solving. They watched everyone else receive service, receive smiles, receive the basic human courtesy that should have been automatic but was apparently conditional on having the right skin color. Grace tried to focus on the clouds outside her window, tried to think about her grandfather and the beach in Savannah and the ceremony they were supposed to perform at sunset. She held the velvet pouch and whispered prayers her grandmother had taught her, prayers for strength and patience and the kind of grace her name represented. But her bladder was full from the orange juice she'd drunk at her grandmother's house that morning, and biology doesn't care about racism or fear or wanting to avoid confrontation. "Grandma, I need to use the bathroom," Grace whispered, dreading what she knew was coming. Dorothy nodded, her face showing the weariness of knowing that even this simple biological need would become another battleground. "Go ahead, baby," she said, and both of them knew it wouldn't be that simple. Both of them sensed that Connie was watching, waiting, looking for any excuse to escalate her campaign of humiliation. Grace unbuckled her seatbelt with trembling fingers and stood carefully, stepping into the aisle on legs that felt like water. She took one step toward the first-class lavatory just 10 feet away, and that's when Connie appeared like she'd been summoned by Grace's movement, blocking the narrow aisle with her body and her authority and her absolute conviction that this black child needed to be controlled. "Where do you think you're going?" Connie demanded, and those 7 words carried the weight of centuries of white women policing black bodies, deciding where they could and couldn't go, what they could and couldn't do, whether they deserved basic human dignity or needed to be taught a lesson about their place in the social order. And what happened next would turn a flight meant for healing into a nightmare that would haunt everyone aboard for the rest of their lives. "The restroom, ma'am," Grace said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper because she'd been raised to be polite even to people who didn't deserve politeness, to say ma'am and sir even when those titles felt like surrender, to maintain her dignity even when others were determined to strip it away. Connie's eyes narrowed and her lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile but was definitely satisfaction, the kind of sick pleasure that comes from having power over someone vulnerable and choosing to abuse it. "First-class lavatories are for first-class passengers," she announced, her voice loud enough that people 5 rows back could hear, loud enough to ensure maximum humiliation, loud enough to make absolutely certain that everyone knew she was putting this black child in her place. Grace's face showed pure confusion, the kind that comes when the rules stop making sense, when the world reveals itself to be fundamentally unfair in ways a 13-year-old brain struggles to process. "But we're in first class," she said, gesturing toward their seats, toward the boarding passes that proved their legitimacy, toward the reality that Connie was choosing to deny. "Sit down," Connie commanded, and the 2 words carried the weight of every white authority figure who'd ever ordered a black person to move, to leave, to know their place and stay in it. Dorothy stood now, her arthritis screaming in protest but her spine still straight, still strong, still refusing to bend even after 72 years of people trying to break it. "My granddaughter needs to use the restroom," she said firmly. "Step aside." The cabin went quiet in that way spaces do when everyone knows something terrible is about to happen, when bystanders recognize they're witnessing injustice and have to make the split-second decision about whether they'll intervene or just watch and film and tell themselves later they did enough by bearing witness. Passengers in nearby rows turned to look, some with concern, some with morbid curiosity, some already reaching for their phones because in 2024 documentation feels like participation even when it's really just voyeurism. Connie's face flushed red, that particular shade that comes when prejudice meets defiance and realizes it might not win this round as easily as expected. "You people always think rules don't apply to you," she hissed, and the phrase "you people" landed like the slur it was designed to be, a verbal weapon sharpened by centuries of usage, a way to other and diminish and dehumanize without technically saying anything prosecutable. The businessman in 2A shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his finger hovering over his laptop keyboard, clearly wrestling with whether to say something or mind his business, whether witnessing hatred obligated him to action or if silent disapproval was sufficient moral currency. He chose silence, chose his spreadsheet, chose the comfortable path of not getting involved because it wasn't his fight, wasn't his problem, wasn't his daughter being humiliated. Behind them, the young mother who'd been filming pulled her phone out again, her hands shaking slightly as she hit record, capturing Connie's venomous expression and Grace's frightened face and Dorothy's protective stance. She would later post this video with hashtags about airline racism and corporate accountability, would rack up millions of views and thousands of comments, would feel like she'd done something meaningful, but in this moment, in the seconds that mattered, her voice remained silent, her body remained seated, her intervention remained theoretical. Grace looked at her grandmother with tears now spilling down her cheeks, looked at this woman who'd survived segregation and Jim Crow and a lifetime of being told she wasn't good enough, and Grace saw in Dorothy's eyes both fury at what was happening and bone-deep weariness at having to fight this same battle again, at 72 years old, while grieving her husband, while trying to give her granddaughter a sacred experience of healing and closure. "Sit down," Connie repeated, her voice rising now, "both of you now." Grace was frightened, genuinely scared in the way children get when adults who should protect them instead become threats, when the rules that should keep you safe instead become weapons used against you. She tried to step past Connie, not toward the bathroom anymore but back toward her seat, back toward the small bubble of safety that her grandmother's presence created, back toward the window where she could clutch her grandfather's ashes and pretend the world wasn't this cruel. And that's when Connie made the decision that would destroy her career, her freedom, and a child's body in one violent motion, the decision that would take 2 seconds to execute but would reverberate through courtrooms and newsrooms and the nightmares of everyone who witnessed it for years to come. She reached out and grabbed Grace's arm, not the gentle guiding touch a professional might use, not the careful hand of someone trying to de-escalate, but a violent yanking grab driven by rage and racism and the absolute conviction that this black girl needed to be physically controlled, needed to be taught through pain and force that she didn't belong here, would never belong here, should never have dared to occupy space meant for people Connie considered worthy. Connie's fingers dug into Grace's thin arm with enough pressure to leave immediate bruises, and then she twisted, wrenched the child's arm at an angle that human joints aren't designed to bend, torqued it with enough violent force that something fundamental had to give, had to break, had to snap. The sound came first, a crack that echoed through the cabin like a gunshot, like a branch breaking, like the physical manifestation of cruelty meeting bone and winning. It was a sound that passengers would describe later in testimony as sickening, as unforgettable, as the exact moment they realized they were witnessing not just discrimination but assault, not just racism but violence, not just wrong but evil. Then came the scream, Grace's voice rising in pure agonizing pain, a sound no child should ever make, a sound that conveyed every ounce of physical suffering and psychological trauma and absolute betrayal of trust that comes when an adult deliberately hurts you. It was the kind of scream that makes parents across the world instinctively move toward their own children, that triggers every protective instinct evolution has programmed into human beings, that makes witnesses feel complicit for not preventing what they're now powerless to undo. Grace collapsed into the aisle, her small body crumpling like a puppet with cut strings, clutching her arm which now bent at an obscene angle, bent where no arm should ever bend, the bone visibly displaced under her skin in a compound fracture that would require surgery and pins and months of painful recovery. The velvet pouch with her grandfather's ashes fell from her other hand and landed on the carpet, and Grace reached for it even through her agony, even through her screaming, reached for it like it was the only solid thing in a world that had just revealed itself to be made of cruelty and pain. Dorothy dropped to her knees beside her granddaughter with a wail that came from somewhere deeper than grief, somewhere primal and ancient, the sound a grandmother makes when she's failed to protect her baby, when she's watched her child be broken right in front of her and couldn't stop it. Grace, she sobbed, "Oh Lord Jesus, Grace," and her hands hovered over her granddaughter's body wanting to help, wanting to hold, wanting to take the pain away but afraid to touch, afraid to make it worse. Afraid that everything she did would only add to the damage already done. And if you're still watching this and you haven't hit that subscribe button yet, if you haven't shared this story with everyone you know, then ask yourself what kind of person stays silent when children are being hurt, what kind of bystander you want to be when injustice happens right in front of you. Hit subscribe right now because we're showing you exactly what happens when racism wears a uniform and nobody stops it until a child's bone breaks. Passengers around the cabin gasped in collective horror, the sound rippling through first class and into business and economy as word spread that something terrible had just happened, that a child was screaming, that there was blood or bone or something wrong enough to make grown adults turn pale and press hands to their mouths. The phones that had been recording Connie's harassment now captured something infinitely worse, 7 different angles of a flight attendant breaking a 13-year-old girl's arm, evidence so clear and damning that no lawyer or PR team or corporate spin could ever explain it away. Connie stepped backward like she'd touched fire, her hands flying up in a gesture that was part denial and part horror as her brain finally caught up with what her body had done, as the reality of snapping a child's bone penetrated through whatever rage-fueled fog had possessed her for the last 45 minutes. She was resisting, Connie stammered, her voice shaking now, stripped of its earlier authority. I didn't mean, but the words died in her throat because everyone could see Grace writhing on the floor, could see the unnatural angle of her forearm, could hear her sobs of agony, and no amount of excuses could make this anything other than what it obviously was. "You broke her arm," a voice rang out from across the aisle, sharp and furious and belonging to Margaret, a 75-year-old white grandmother who'd been watching this harassment build with increasing discomfort but had stayed silent, had told herself it wasn't her place to intervene, had chosen comfort over courage until the sound of breaking bone finally shattered her complacency. "She's a child," Margaret shouted, standing now with tears streaming down her face. "What is wrong with you? What kind of monster hurts a baby?" From row 7, A black woman named Evelyn rushed forward with the kind of purposeful movement that comes from decades of nursing experience, her body already assessing and triaging before her conscious mind fully processed what she was seeing. She was 68 years old, a retired emergency room nurse who'd spent 40 years treating gunshot wounds and car accidents and every kind of human suffering Chicago's South Side could produce, but the sight of Grace's arm made even her experienced face go pale with shock. "This is a serious fracture," Evelyn said as she knelt beside Dorothy and Grace, her hands gentle as she examined the injury without touching, her voice steady even though her eyes showed horror at what had been done to this child. "She needs emergency care," she said loudly enough for the entire cabin to hear. "Now, this cannot wait. This is a compound fracture that requires immediate surgical intervention." She looked up at Connie, who was still standing there frozen, looked at this flight attendant who'd wielded her petty authority like a weapon and had now crossed a line from harassment into felony assault, and Evelyn's voice carried all the contempt and fury that every witness was feeling. "You monster," she said quietly, and somehow the quiet made it more devastating than if she'd screamed it. Dorothy was sobbing now, uncontrollable tears streaming down her face as she tried to comfort Grace while Evelyn worked, tried to stroke her granddaughter's face without jarring her broken arm, tried to find words that could possibly make this better when nothing could make this better, when her baby was lying on an airplane floor in agony because a grown woman had decided that black skin in first class deserved violence. "Stay with me, baby," Dorothy whispered through her tears. "Grandma's here, we're getting you help, you're going to be okay," and she kept repeating it like a prayer, like if she said it enough times it would become true, like her love could somehow undo the damage that hatred had inflicted. Grace looked up at her grandmother through eyes clouded with pain and shock, her face streaked with tears and snot, her body trembling, her 13 years of life not nearly enough preparation for this kind of suffering, for this kind of betrayal. "Grandma," she whimpered, and then her eyes found the velvet pouch that had fallen beside her, the one containing her grandfather's ashes, the whole reason they were on this flight, the sacred mission that was supposed to bring healing and had instead brought horror. "I still have Grandpa's ashes," she said, her voice breaking on every word. "Don't let them take them. Don't let them take him away from me." Dorothy's heart shattered into pieces that would never quite fit back together, shattered at hearing her granddaughter worry about her grandfather's remains while her own arm was broken, shattered at the absolute wrongness of a child having to endure this, shattered at her own powerlessness to protect the baby she loved more than her own life. "Nobody's taking anything from us, sweetheart," Dorothy sobbed. "We're going to scatter those ashes together. I promise you, I promise." Evelyn was tearing fabric from a blanket she'd pulled from an overhead bin, was using a pillow as padding, was creating a makeshift splint to immobilize Grace's arm because every movement sent fresh waves of agony through the child's body. She worked with practiced efficiency, but her hands shook slightly, and she kept murmuring, "I'm so sorry, sweetheart. I know this hurts. You're being so brave," while tears ran down her own face. The commotion had finally reached the cockpit where Captain Harold Williams had been flying the plane in blissful ignorance of the nightmare unfolding in his first-class cabin, focused on altitude and airspeed and the routine mechanics of getting passengers safely from Charleston to Savannah. But now his co-pilot was pointing to the cabin camera feeds. Now the senior flight attendant was on the intercom saying, "Captain, we need you out here immediately." Now he could hear even through the reinforced cockpit door the sound of a child screaming. He engaged the autopilot and emerged from the cockpit to find his first-class cabin transformed into a crime scene. Passengers standing and craning to see, a child on the floor with her arm grotesquely bent, an elderly black woman sobbing over her, a nurse creating a splint from airline materials, and his flight attendant Connie standing against the galley wall looking like someone who just watched her entire life collapse. "What happened here?" Captain Williams demanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd been flying commercial aircraft for 33 years, who'd handled emergencies from engine failures to medical crises to unruly passengers, but who'd never, not once, had to deal with a crew member assaulting a child. 3 passengers started talking at once, their voices overlapping in their urgency to explain, to testify, to make sure the captain understood that this wasn't an accident or a misunderstanding but deliberate violence. "She grabbed the girl," one said. "She twisted her arm," another added, "We have it on video," a third shouted, holding up a phone. Captain Williams took a phone from the businessman in 2A and watched 5 seconds of footage, watched Connie grab Grace, watched her twist with obvious force, watched the child collapse screaming, and his face hardened into an expression that 30 years of professionalism had taught him to maintain even when he wanted to rage. He handed the phone back and turned to Connie with eyes that held nothing but contempt. "You're relieved of duty," he said, his voice cold as January ice. "Immediately, go to the rear galley. Do not speak. Do not move. Security will handle you upon landing." Connie tried to protest, tried to mount some defense, tried to explain that she'd just been enforcing rules, that the girl had been difficult, that this whole situation had been blown out of proportion. "Captain," she started, but Williams cut her off with a hand gesture that made it clear her words meant nothing, that her excuses were worthless, that her career had ended the moment she'd broken a child's arm. "I said go," he commanded. "No." Connie walked toward the rear galley on legs that barely held her weight, past passengers who stared at her with expressions ranging from disgust to fury to something approaching pity, though most faces showed nothing but contempt for what she'd done. The young mother who'd been filming whispered, "You should be ashamed," as Connie passed, and a businessman muttered, "Monster," loud enough for her to hear, and with each step the reality of her situation sank deeper into Connie's consciousness. The understanding that she just destroyed her 26-year career, her pension, her freedom, possibly her entire future, all because she couldn't tolerate a black child sitting in first class. Captain Williams moved to the intercom with the practiced calm of someone who'd delivered difficult news before, who'd announced mechanical failures and weather delays and emergency landings, but never with this weight, never with the knowledge that his own crew member had committed a violent crime against a passenger. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain." His voice filled the cabin. "We are making an emergency medical diversion to the nearest suitable airport. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We will be on the ground as quickly as safely possible." The plane began its descent, the change in altitude adding pressure to everyone's ears, adding physical discomfort to the emotional trauma already saturating the cabin. Grace whimpered with each shift in altitude, each movement sending fresh agony through her broken arm despite Evelyn's careful splinting, despite the nurse's gentle hands trying to keep everything stabilized and immobilized. Dorothy had moved from kneeling to sitting on the floor beside her granddaughter, her old knees screaming in protest but her body refusing to leave Grace's side even for a second, refusing to put any distance between herself and this child she'd failed to protect. She stroked Grace's face with trembling fingers, pushed sweat-dampened hair back from her forehead, whispered prayers and promises and apologies that tumbled over each other in no particular order. "Stay with me, baby," Dorothy kept repeating. "Grandma's here, we're almost on the ground, they're going to fix your arm, you're going to be okay," and she said it as much to convince herself as to comfort Grace, said it to push back against the terrible knowledge that her granddaughter would carry scars from this, physical scars yes, but worse psychological scars, trauma that would shape how she saw the world, how she moved through it, how she trusted or didn't trust the adults who were supposed to keep her safe. Margaret, the white grandmother from across the aisle, had knelt down beside them now, had finally moved from witnessing to participating, had crossed the small distance that separated bystander from ally. She took Dorothy's free hand and squeezed it, tears streaming down her own 75-year-old face, tears for this child she didn't know, tears for her own silence during the harassment that led to this violence, tears for the realization that she could have stopped this, should have stopped this, might have prevented this broken bone if only she'd found her voice 30 minutes earlier. "I'm so sorry this happened," Margaret whispered. "I'm praying for your granddaughter, we all are." And it was true, around the cabin passengers who'd been silent during the harassment were now bowing their heads, now offering prayers, now finding their compassion after the damage was done, after their intervention could no longer prevent only witness. Dorothy nodded because she couldn't speak, couldn't find words that wouldn't come out as screams, couldn't trust her voice not to break completely if she tried to respond. She just held her granddaughter's good hand and accepted Margaret's grip and let the tears fall because what else was there to do at 30,000 feet while your baby suffered and strangers prayed and the plane descended toward an emergency landing that couldn't come fast enough. Around the cabin the atmosphere was heavy with shame and horror, heavy with the collective guilt of people who'd watched harassment escalate and had chosen comfort over intervention, had chosen their phones over their voices, had chosen to document rather than disrupt until disruption became impossible and all that remained was documentation of their own moral failure. The businessman in 2A who'd frowned but stayed silent now sat with his head in his hands, his laptop closed, his spreadsheets forgotten, his comfortable life of not getting involved suddenly feeling like complicity, like cowardice, like something he'd have to examine in therapy or in church or in the mirror when he got home to his own children. The young mother who'd filmed everything was crying now too, her phone still out but her hands shaking so badly the video was unusable, shaking with the realization that she'd gotten great footage for social media but had done nothing in real time to help, had prioritized content over courage, had chosen viral potential over using her body to stand between a child and violence. Even the college students in the back who'd been laughing earlier, who'd made jokes about the old black lady getting uppity, who'd smirked when Connie made her comments about etiquette and standards, even they sat in stunned silence now, their earlier amusement curdled into something that tasted like shame, like the recognition that their laughter had been fuel for Connie's fire, had been permission for her to escalate. Grace's screams had subsided into whimpers now, the initial shock of the break giving way to a deeper sustained agony that Evelyn recognized as dangerous, as the kind of pain that could send a child into shock if not managed carefully. She checked Grace's pulse, checked her color, checked for signs of shock while maintaining the splint and keeping up a steady stream of reassuring words. "You're doing so good, sweetheart," Evelyn murmured. "I know it hurts, I know, but you're being so brave. Your grandma is right here. We're getting you to a hospital. They're going to take good care of you." Grace's eyes found Evelyn's face and held there, searching for something to anchor to, some adult who seemed competent and calm and trustworthy in a world that had just proven itself to be none of those things. "The nurse," she whispered. "Are you a nurse?" "I am, baby," Evelyn said gently. "I've been a nurse for 40 years. I've seen a lot of broken bones, and I promise you this one will heal. You're going to be okay." "Will I be able to dance again?" Grace asked, and the question broke something in every adult who heard it, broke them with its innocence and its tragedy and its reminder that this wasn't just a broken bone but a broken dream, a dance recital she'd practiced for, a performance she'd never get to give, a future altered by violence she didn't deserve. "Yes, sweetheart," Evelyn lied, because sometimes lies are kinder than truth, sometimes hope matters more than accuracy, sometimes a child in agony needs to believe in healing even when the adults know that some things stay broken forever. "You'll dance again, I promise." The plane touched down with a gentle bump that still made Grace cry out, still sent pain shooting through her arm despite Evelyn's splint, despite everyone's careful attempts to cushion and protect. Through the windows passengers could see emergency vehicles already lined up on the tarmac, ambulances and fire trucks and airport security, a whole convoy of help that had been scrambled the moment Captain Williams radioed ahead about the assault on a minor. The plane taxied to the gate faster than usual, Captain Williams bypassing the normal slow crawl in favor of getting this child to medical care as quickly as possible. The moment the aircraft stopped moving and the seatbelt sign dinged off, the forward cabin door opened and paramedics rushed aboard, two of them, a man and a woman, both moving with practiced efficiency toward the child still lying in the aisle. The male paramedic was young and black with kind eyes and gentle hands, and when he saw Grace clutching the velvet pouch to her chest even through her agony, saw her holding onto it like a lifeline, he understood immediately that this wasn't just an injury case but a trauma case, that this child needed emotional care as much as physical. "My grandpa," Grace whispered to him as he knelt beside her, her voice hoarse from screaming, "Please don't take him, please." The paramedic looked at the small velvet pouch, looked at Dorothy's tear-streaked face, looked at this scene of violence and grief and racism playing out on an airplane floor, and he made a decision that protocol didn't require but humanity demanded. "He stays with you, sweetheart," the paramedic said gently. "I promise, your grandpa goes wherever you go." The paramedics worked with careful precision to transfer Grace from the airplane floor to a stretcher, every movement calculated to minimize pain but still drawing whimpers from the child whose arm hung at an angle that made seasoned medical professionals wince. The female paramedic started in 4-line for pain medication while her partner secured the splint Evelyn had created, both of them murmuring gentle reassurances while Grace clutched the velvet pouch containing her grandfather's ashes against her chest with her uninjured hand. Dorothy climbed to her feet with Margaret's help, her knees stiff from kneeling on the hard cabin floor, her whole body feeling decades older than it had when they'd boarded this flight just 2 hours ago. She gathered their bags with shaking hands, grabbed Grace's backpack and her own purse, made sure they had everything because even in crisis her mind worked through practical details, through the tasks that kept you moving when stopping meant collapsing. "Ma'am, you can ride with us to the hospital," the young black paramedic said to Dorothy, his voice kind and respectful in a way that felt like cool water after the burning contempt Connie had subjected them to. "Your granddaughter needs you." As they prepared to wheel Grace off the aircraft, Captain Williams appeared beside the stretcher, his face showing a mix of professional composure and barely contained fury. He looked down at Grace with genuine compassion, this child who'd been assaulted by his crew member, this passenger he'd failed to protect even though protection was supposed to be part of his job. "Young lady," he said gently, "I am so profoundly sorry for what happened to you on my aircraft. What was done to you was criminal and wrong and should never have happened. I promise you that the person responsible will face full consequences." Grace managed a small nod, her pain medication starting to work but her eyes still glazed with suffering. The paramedics began moving the stretcher down the aisle and passengers stood aside to let them pass, some reaching out to touch Dorothy's shoulder, to murmur apologies and prayers, to offer support that came too late but was offered nonetheless. As Grace was carried through first class toward the exit, airline officials were already boarding through the rear door, a small army of corporate representatives and security personnel whose presence meant that whatever happened next would be official and documented and probably devastating for everyone involved. 2 men in dark suits, a woman with a tablet and an expression of barely controlled rage, 3 airport security officers with radios crackling, all of them moving with purpose toward the rear galley where Connie Morrison waited in the kind of silence that comes from knowing your life is over. The lead corporate representative was Marcus Chin, Regional Director of Passenger Services, a man who'd spent 15 years handling airline crises from medical emergencies to unruly passengers to mechanical failures, but who'd never in his career had to deal with a flight attendant physically assaulting a child. He'd watched the videos that passengers had already uploaded to social media during the descent, had seen 7 different angles of Connie grabbing and twisting Grace's arm, had listened to the audio of bone breaking and a child screaming, and he'd known before the plane even landed that this situation had exactly one possible resolution. Behind him walked Janet Rodriguez from Corporate Human Resources, a woman whose job normally involved performance reviews and benefits administration and the mundane bureaucracy of employee management, but who today carried termination paperwork already prepared, already authorized by executives who'd seen the videos and understood that Connie Morrison's employment had ended the moment she'd broken that child's bone. They walked directly to the rear galley where Connie sat on a fold-down jump seat, her face pale and drawn, her hands trembling, her earlier righteous anger replaced by the dawning horror of someone who'd let hatred override judgment and was now facing consequences she'd never imagined possible. When she saw the corporate representatives and security officers approaching, when she saw their expressions and their documentation and their handcuffs, something inside her finally broke and she started to cry. Airport security officers moved to either side of Connie as Marcus Chin stood in front of her with the termination paperwork and an expression of pure contempt. "Connie Morrison," he said formally, his voice loud enough that passengers still seated in the rear could hear, "you are terminated effective immediately for assault on a minor. Your employment with this airline is ended. You will be handed over to local law enforcement to face criminal charges." Connie's tears turned to sobs, desperate and ugly, the sound of someone watching their entire world collapse in real time. "It was an accident," she wailed, reaching for excuses that wouldn't save her. "She moved wrong. I didn't mean to hurt her. I was just trying to maintain order." Janet Rodriguez held up her tablet showing the videos, showing Connie's face twisted with rage as she grabbed Grace, showing the deliberate twisting motion, showing evidence so clear that no jury would ever believe the accident defense. "We have 7 video recordings," she said coldly, "showing you grabbed and twisted a child's arm with deliberate force, showing you assaulting a minor after 45 minutes of racial harassment. There was no accident here, Ms. Morrison. There was only hatred and violence." The security officers produced handcuffs and Connie's sobs intensified as the metal closed around her wrists in front of every remaining passenger, in front of the crew she'd worked with, in front of the smartphone cameras still recording, still documenting, still ensuring that this moment of consequences would live forever on the internet for anyone who searched her name. "You can't do this," Connie screamed as they began leading her toward the rear exit. "I have 26 years with this company. I have rights. This is excessive. This is unfair." "What's unfair," Marcus Chin said quietly as she passed him, "is that a 13-year-old girl who was traveling to scatter her grandfather's ashes now has a broken arm and trauma that will follow her for life. What's excessive is that you used your authority to terrorize a child because you didn't like her skin color. Your lucky criminal charges are all you're facing." They walked Connie off through the rear exit where media cameras were already waiting, where local news had gotten wind of the story from social media and had dispatched crews to capture the perp walk, where Connie Morrison would become the face of airline racism and workplace violence in a news cycle that would dominate for weeks. She tried to hide her face, but the handcuffs made it impossible, tried to avoid the cameras, but they were everywhere, tried to maintain some shred of dignity, but dignity had abandoned her the moment she'd grabbed a child in hatred. Back in the cabin, passengers watched through windows as Connie was led away, watched as she was placed in a police vehicle, watched as 26 years of employment ended in handcuffs and humiliation. Some felt satisfaction at seeing consequences delivered so swiftly, some felt uncomfortable witnessing another human being destroyed even if they'd brought it on themselves, some felt nothing but grief for Grace and fury that it had taken a broken bone before anyone with power had intervened. Captain Williams stood at the front of the cabin and picked up the intercom one final time, his voice heavy with emotion he normally kept locked away during flights. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "I want to apologize on behalf of this airline for what you witnessed today. What happened to that young passenger was criminal and unacceptable. We failed in our duty to keep her safe, and I am personally devastated by that failure." He paused, his throat tight. "The crew member responsible has been terminated and arrested," he continued, "but that doesn't undo the harm, doesn't heal that child's arm, doesn't erase the trauma we allowed to happen on this aircraft. I am deeply sorry." The cabin remained silent as his words settled, as passengers processed their own roles as witnesses and bystanders, as everyone began the uncomfortable work of examining their own consciences. At the hospital, Grace was rushed directly into the emergency room where a trauma team was already waiting, alerted by the paramedics during transport that they were bringing in a pediatric patient with a compound fracture caused by assault. A detail that made the receiving physicians exchange grim looks because broken bones from falls or sports injuries were common, but broken bones from adult violence against children triggered protocols that went beyond medical treatment into mandatory reporting and evidence preservation. The emergency room physician, Dr. Sarah Kim, was 42 years old with 2 daughters of her own at home, and when she saw Grace's arm with the bone displaced and the surrounding tissue already swelling and bruising, when she saw this child's tear-streaked face and heard the story of how a flight attendant had deliberately twisted her arm, something shifted in her professional composure and she had to take a breath before speaking. "Sweetheart, we're going to take excellent care of you," Dr. Kim said gently as she examined the fracture. "But I'm not going to lie to you. This is a serious break and you're going to need surgery to fix it properly. We'll put you to sleep so you won't feel anything, and when you wake up you'll have pins holding your bones in place while they heal." Grace nodded weakly, the pain medication making her foggy but not quite able to erase the throbbing agony in her arm or the deeper psychological pain of what had been done to her. "Will I still be able to dance?" she asked again, this question that had become her anchor, this dream that felt more important now that it had been threatened. Dr. Kim looked at Dorothy, who stood beside the bed still holding the velvet pouch because Grace had made her promise not to let it out of their sight, looked at this grandmother whose eyes begged for hope even if it wasn't entirely truthful. "Yes, honey," Dr. Kim said, choosing kindness over clinical precision. "With time and physical therapy you should regain full function, but you'll need to be patient with your body while it heals." What she didn't say was that compound fractures in adolescence sometimes healed with complications, that Grace might always have reduced flexibility or chronic pain, that the psychological trauma of the injury could create movement patterns that affected her dancing even after the physical healing was complete. Some truths could wait until the child wasn't lying in an emergency room still processing the violence that had been done to her. The orthopedic surgeon, Dr. James Patterson, came in to explain the surgery in terms a 13-year-old could understand, talking about pins and plates and healing times, about the cast she'd wear for 3 months and the physical therapy that would follow. Grace listened with glazed eyes, nodding when appropriate, but Dorothy could tell her granddaughter had checked out emotionally, had retreated into some protected space inside herself where the words couldn't fully reach. They took Grace to surgery 2 hours after her arrival, Dorothy walking beside the gurney as far as they'd allow, squeezing her granddaughter's good hand and whispering, "I love you, baby. Grandpa is watching over you. You're going to be fine." Even though Dorothy's own faith was badly shaken, even though she was questioning a God who would allow her grandbaby to suffer like this. In the surgical waiting room, Dorothy sat alone with the velvet pouch in her lap and finally allowed herself to completely fall apart, finally let the sobs come that she'd been holding back while trying to be strong for Grace, finally released the grief and rage and helplessness that had been building since Connie first approached their seats with contempt in her eyes. She cried for her granddaughter's broken arm and broken dreams, cried for her own failure to protect this child, cried for her husband James who wasn't here to help shoulder this burden, cried for the persistent reality of racism that had followed her from segregation through civil rights through 7 decades to this hospital waiting room. Margaret, the white grandmother from the plane, appeared in the waiting room an hour later carrying coffee and looking uncertain about whether she'd be welcome. "I called the hospital to find out where you were," she said quietly. "I hope it's okay that I came. I couldn't leave things the way they were." Dorothy looked up with swollen eyes and saw genuine remorse on Margaret's face. Saw another grandmother who'd watched a child be hurt and was carrying her own guilt about not intervening sooner. "Sit down," Dorothy said, gesturing to the empty chair beside her, because anger took energy she didn't have, because maybe Margaret's late solidarity was better than no solidarity at all, because 72 years had taught her that building bridges was harder but more useful than burning them. They sat together in silence for a while, two grandmothers from different worlds united by witnessing the same horror, until Margaret finally spoke. "I should have said something earlier," she whispered. "I saw what that flight attendant was doing and I just watched. I told myself it wasn't my business, that I didn't want to cause a scene, and then she trailed off because there were no words adequate to the magnitude of that failure." Dorothy was quiet for a long moment before responding. "You're here now," she said finally. "That doesn't undo what happened, but it means something that you're here now." Margaret started crying, this 75-year-old woman who'd lived through her own version of history, who'd probably witnessed countless moments of injustice and chosen comfort over courage, who was maybe finally reckoning with the cost of that choice. "I have grandchildren Grace's age," she said through her tears. "If someone had done that to them, I'd want the whole world to burn, but I watched it happen to your granddaughter and I just sat there." The surgery took 3 hours. 3 hours of Dorothy and Margaret sitting together in that waiting room, talking sometimes about their grandchildren and their lives and the world they'd lived through, sitting in silence other times while the television mounted in the corner played news coverage of the incident which had already gone viral, video of Connie breaking Grace's arm viewed millions of times, hashtags trending, airline stocks dropping, the whole machinery of modern outrage churning at full speed. Dr. Patterson emerged finally, still in his surgical scrubs, his face showing the satisfied exhaustion of a difficult procedure completed successfully. "The surgery went well," he told Dorothy. "We inserted 2 pins to stabilize the radius and ulna. Everything is properly aligned. She should heal without complications if she follows the recovery protocol carefully." "Can I see her?" Dorothy asked, already standing, already moving toward wherever her grandbaby was. "She's in recovery now," Dr. Patterson said, still groggy from anesthesia. "You can sit with her while she wakes up." Grace looked impossibly small in the hospital bed, her arm wrapped in a temporary splint that would be replaced with a proper cast once the swelling went down, and 4 in her other arm delivering fluids and pain medication, monitors beeping softly tracking her vital signs. Dorothy took the chair beside the bed and reached for Grace's good hand, and that's when her granddaughter's eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first then slowly finding Dorothy's face. "Grandma," Grace whispered, her voice rough from the breathing tube they'd used during surgery. "I'm here, baby," Dorothy said, squeezing her hand gently. "You did so good. The surgery is over, your arm is fixed." Grace's eyes filled with tears, whether from pain or emotion or the lingering effects of anesthesia Dorothy couldn't tell. "Did we miss Grandpa's ceremony?" she asked, and the fact that this was her first concern, that even coming out of surgery for a broken arm caused by racist violence she was worried about scattering her grandfather's ashes, broke Dorothy's heart into pieces so small she didn't know if they'd ever reassemble. No, sweetheart, Dorothy said, her own tears falling freely now. We're just delayed. When you're healed, we'll scatter those ashes together. Your grandpa would want us to wait for you. He'd want you to be well. Grace managed the smallest smile, her hand squeezing Dorothy's with what little strength she had. He always said I was stubborn like you, she whispered. Dorothy laughed through her tears, a sound that was half sob and half genuine amusement. And proud of it, baby, and proud of it. 1 week after the incident, while Grace was still in the hospital recovering from surgery complications that had extended her stay, the airline's CEO personally called Dorothy's cell phone, a number he'd obtained through corporate channels because this situation demanded the highest level of executive attention. His name was David Martinez, and he'd been running the airline for 6 years, had navigated labor strikes and fuel crises and pandemic shutdowns, but nothing in his career had prepared him for the viral videos of his flight attendant breaking a child's arm. Mrs. Turner, he said when Dorothy answered, his voice heavy with genuine remorse, I'm calling to offer my personal apology for what happened to your granddaughter on our aircraft. What Connie Morrison did was criminal and unconscionable and represents a complete failure of our duty to protect passengers. Dorothy listened in silence, her free hand resting on Grace's hospital bed where her granddaughter slept fitfully, her casted arm elevated on pillows, her face still showing the strain of pain that medication couldn't quite erase. Ms. Morrison has been arrested and charged with felony assault on a minor, Martinez continued. She's facing up to 10 years in prison, her employment is terminated, her pension revoked, and we are cooperating fully with law enforcement to ensure she faces appropriate consequences. He paused, and Dorothy could hear him take a breath before continuing. We'd like to offer a settlement for Grace's medical expenses, pain and suffering, and future care, along with lifetime complimentary travel for your entire family, but more importantly, Mrs. Turner, we want to make systemic changes to prevent this from ever happening again. Dorothy finally spoke, her voice quiet but carrying the weight of 72 years of watching promises get made and broken. What kind of changes, she asked. Martinez explained their plan to implement mandatory de-escalation and anti-bias training for all crew members, to create anonymous reporting systems for passengers who experience discrimination, to establish a passenger advocacy office with real authority to investigate complaints. We want to name the program Grace's Promise, he said, as a commitment that what happened to your granddaughter will drive meaningful change. Dorothy was quiet for a long moment, looking at Grace's sleeping face, at the cast that would stay on her arm for 3 months, at the physical therapy appointments already scheduled, at the dance recital that had been cancelled, at all the visible and invisible scars this child would carry because a flight attendant couldn't tolerate black skin in first class. I'll accept your settlement, Dorothy said finally, but I have one condition. I want Grace's story told. I want every airline in this country to know what happens when you let hatred wear a uniform. My granddaughter's arm will heal eventually, but the memory of being broken by a grown woman, that stays forever. Martinez agreed immediately, authorized the airline's PR department to cooperate with media requests, to allow Dorothy and Grace to tell their story without legal interference, to use this tragedy as a teaching moment rather than trying to bury it in non-disclosure agreements and corporate silence. 3 months later, on a warm afternoon in June, Grace sat in an orthopedist's office while Dr. Patterson used a small saw to cut away the cast that had been her constant companion through the end of 8th grade, through her graduation ceremony where she'd received academic honors with one arm, through countless physical therapy sessions where she'd learned to grip and flex and slowly rebuild strength in muscles that had atrophied. The cast came off and Grace's arm looked thin and pale and strange, the surgical scars still pink and raised, the muscle tone noticeably different from her other arm. She flexed her fingers experimentally, wincing at the stiffness, the reduced range of motion that Dr. Patterson had warned would improve with continued therapy but might never fully return to normal. You're healing well, Dr. Patterson said encouragingly. Keep up with the exercises and you should regain most of your function, but remember to be patient with yourself, healing takes time. Grace nodded, running her fingers over the scars that would mark her skin forever, physical reminders of the day a woman's hatred had turned violent. Can I dance again? She asked for what felt like the 100th time, this question that had become her mantra, her measure of whether she'd survived or merely endured. Dr. Patterson hesitated, choosing his words carefully. You can dance, he said, but it might not feel exactly the same as before. You might have some limitations, some movements that are harder or painful, but yes, Grace, you can dance. It wasn't the answer she'd hoped for, but it was honest, and Grace had learned over the past 3 months that honest was better than kind when kind meant lying about hard truths. She looked at her grandmother who'd been with her through every doctor's appointment, every therapy session, every moment of frustration and pain and slow progress. "Can we go to Savannah now?" Grace asked quietly. "I'm ready to say goodbye to Grandpa." Dorothy's eyes filled with tears because her granddaughter had waited 3 months, had postponed the healing ceremony they'd originally planned, had held onto those ashes through surgery and recovery and endless hospital visits, had carried her grandfather's remains like a promise that eventually they'd finish what they'd started. "Yes, baby," Dorothy said, pulling Grace into a careful hug that avoided her still tender arm. "We can go to Savannah. Let's bring your grandpa home." That same week, they boarded another flight, this time with corporate escorts and VIP treatment and flight attendants who'd been specifically briefed about who they were and what had happened and how to ensure their journey was nothing but respectful. The airline had upgraded them to first class again, and Grace hesitated at the entrance to that cabin, her body remembering trauma even as her mind tried to push forward. A young black flight attendant named Keisha noticed Grace's hesitation and knelt down to her eye level, her expression full of compassion and understanding. "I heard what happened to you," Keisha said gently. "I'm so sorry, but I want you to know you're safe with us. Always, you belong here and we're honored to have you." Grace managed a small smile, the first genuine one since the incident, and found her voice. "Thank you," she said. "My grandma says most people are good, they just need reminding sometimes." Keisha's eyes glistened as she stood and showed them to their seats, as she brought them juice and snacks without being asked, as she checked on them throughout the flight with genuine care rather than performative customer service. At sunset, Grace and Dorothy stood on the beach in Savannah, their bare feet sinking into sand still warm from the afternoon sun, waves rolling in with that eternal rhythm that had been here long before their pain and would continue long after their healing. This was the exact spot where James had proposed 53 years ago, had gotten down on one knee in front of a 19-year-old Dorothy and promised to love her until his last breath. A promise he'd kept even though that last breath had come too soon and left a hole in their family that would never quite close. Dorothy opened the velvet pouch with trembling hands, her arthritis making the simple motion difficult, and Grace reached over with her weaker arm to help, both of them working together to release the ashes they'd carried through so much trauma, through broken bones and surgeries and 3 months of healing that was physical but also deeper, more fundamental, the kind of healing that happens when you survive something that tried to break you and discover you're still standing. "Go home, my love," Dorothy whispered into the ocean breeze, watching the ashes catch the wind and dance across the waves. "Rest now, we'll be okay. Our granddaughter is strong, strong as you ever were. She survived what tried to destroy her and she's still here, still fighting, still believing the world can be better." Grace leaned into her grandmother, her casted arm that had finally come off just days ago still weaker than the other, still scarred and stiff, still a reminder of violence but also of survival. "I love you, Grandpa," she said softly. "Thank you for teaching me to be brave. Thank you for showing me that hate is heavy but love is light. Thank you for believing I could be anything." They stood together watching the ashes disappear into the Atlantic, watching the sun sink lower toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. 2 generations of black women who'd endured segregation and discrimination and outright violence but were still here, still whole in the ways that mattered, still unbroken even when the world had tried its hardest to break them. The beach was nearly empty except for a few evening joggers and a family packing up their umbrellas, and for a moment Grace and Dorothy existed in a bubble of peace, of closure, of the kind of healing that comes not from fixing what's broken but from learning to carry the brokenness with grace and dignity. "We did it, Grandma," Grace whispered. "We brought him home." Dorothy wrapped her arm around her granddaughter and let the tears flow freely, tears of grief, yes, but also relief and pride and love so overwhelming it felt like it might lift them both off the sand. "Yes, baby," she said, "we did it, together." 6 months after that terrible flight, Connie Morrison's trial concluded in a courthouse packed with media and spectators and people who'd followed the story from viral video to criminal prosecution. The jury had deliberated for exactly 2 hours before returning with their verdict, and when the forewoman stood to deliver it, her voice was clear and certain, guilty of felony assault on a minor. Connie had collapsed at the defense table, her face buried in her hands, her attorney already preparing appeals that would ultimately fail because the evidence was overwhelming, because 7 different camera angles had captured her grabbing and twisting a child's arm, because there was simply no defense for what everyone could see with their own eyes. The judge was a black woman named Honorable Patricia Williams, 63 years old and nearing retirement after a career spent trying to balance justice with mercy, trying to see the humanity in defendants while protecting victims, trying to make the legal system work for everyone even when it so often failed the most vulnerable. She looked at Connie Morrison with an expression that contained no sympathy, no softness, no inclination toward leniency. "Ms. Morrison," Judge Williams said, her voice filling the courtroom, "you broke a child's arm because you couldn't tolerate her presence in first class. You saw a black girl and her grandmother and decided they didn't belong. You were wrong. She belonged there. She belongs everywhere. And you belong in prison." 8 years, Judge Williams pronounced, no possibility of parole, and the courtroom erupted in whispers and gasps and the sounds of Connie's family weeping in the gallery. Grace watched from the front row, her grandmother beside her, her arm fully healed now except for the scars that would never fade, scars she'd learned to see not as marks of shame but as evidence of survival. She didn't smile when the sentence was read, didn't feel the triumph she'd expected, felt instead a complicated mix of relief and sadness and exhaustion because justice delivered didn't undo the harm caused, didn't give back the 3 months in a cast or the dance recital she'd missed or the innocence that had been stolen when an adult had chosen violence. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed asking Grace how she felt, asking what she wanted people to learn from her story, asking for soundbites that would play on evening news and morning shows and cable networks hungry for content about racism, injustice, and the viral video that had captured it all. Grace considered the question carefully. This 13-year-old who'd become 14 in a hospital bed, who'd learned more about hatred and healing than most adults ever have to face. "My grandpa taught me that hatred is heavy," she said simply. "The people who carry it get tired eventually, but love is light. It never wears you out," and she looked at Dorothy standing beside her. "I choose love, every time." The cameras flashed and the reporters scribbled and somewhere the footage would be edited and packaged and distributed. Another moment of Grace's trauma turned into content, but she didn't mind because if her pain could teach something, could change something, could prevent another child from experiencing what she'd endured, then maybe the breaking had purpose beyond just destruction. And if you've watched Grace's entire story and you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, if you haven't hit that like button, if you haven't shared this with everyone who needs to understand that racism isn't history but present tense violence happening right now to real children, then what are you waiting for? Subscribe right now because stories like Grace's need to be told and amplified and remembered, because silence in the face of injustice makes you complicit, because the next child who gets hurt might not have a grandmother as strong as Dorothy or might not survive with as much grace as Grace. Hit that subscribe button and join us in fighting against the hatred that breaks children. Dorothy wrapped her arm around her granddaughter as the cameras continued to flash and click, 2 generations standing together in the aftermath of violence, scarred but unbroken, traumatized but still fighting, still believing despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary that love could win, that justice could happen, that the world could be better if enough people chose courage over comfort. "That's my Grace," Dorothy said to the reporters, to the cameras, to anyone listening, named after the very thing that carries us through. They walked away together, heads high, hearts full, carrying their scars like medals earned in a war they never asked to fight but had survived anyway, proof that breaking doesn't always mean broken, that some things heal stronger than they were before, that grace and love and stubborn dignity can outlast hatred every single time.